Governments exist for the very purpose of establishing and enforcing good moral order. That's the sole reason that governments exist, to establish and enforce moral order among the people. Thomas Jefferson made this statement in his first inaugural address. This is in 1801. He said, "A wise and frugal government that will keep people from injuring one another and otherwise leave them alone that they might pursue their own desires or regulate their own conduct, and to keep them from stealing, that is, the government, from the mouth of labor the bread that it has earned, this is the sum of good government." And that is to maintain and enforce good moral order. That's the reason that governments exist. The same thing is the case regarding governing societies. For example, there are many organizations to which lawyers belong, to which physicians belong, and those organizations also have governing standards that they must abide by. And those governing standards are simply to regulate the conduct of those in its organization. So whether it be the American Bar Association or different organizations in Texas that governs the Texas lawyers, those are simply governing standards to maintain good moral order. The same thing is the case regarding physicians. Or we might also speak about teachers. Teachers also have, in separate schools or in separate unions or in separate organizations, in different districts and regions, they have standards of behavior, of conduct, to which all the teachers must abide. And it is designed to keep that moral order in society, in that organization. So all governments are designed, in the primary, if not the sole purpose of government, is simply to maintain and enforce good moral order. That's the reason that governments exist. When the moral order, however, is ignored, or when the moral order in the populace is set aside and disregarded, then that government itself is an empty, hollow shell and is ready for dissolution and destruction. And it is only a matter of time before ultimate collapse comes. That's the law of God. And that's the case always regarding governments. So that means that no matter how wealthy a government or a society may become, it matters not how much money in the trillions of dollars Donald Trump may bring into the United States. It matters not how much the Dow Jones might exceed and go higher and higher. It matters not how high the stock market may rise. The wealth has nothing to do with the stability of society. Stability comes from a good moral order. And when that is ignored, it doesn't matter how wealthy a nation may be. Collapse is inevitable and perhaps even imminent. I want you to meet Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II reigned in the northern kingdom of Israel from 781 to 740 BC. He was the longest reigning king in the northern kingdom. So let's back up and notice some of the history surrounding that very briefly. As you recall, the kingdom split in 930 BC. At Solomon's death, there were the 10 tribes to the north and two to the south. And the two in the south was simply called the kingdom of Judah because Benjamin was amalgamated into Judah. So we have the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. We're focusing upon the kingdom of Israel in the north only. During their 200-year period of existence, it had 20 different kings. And it also had 9 different dynasties. And that fact alone spells violence and bloodshed. Because in the south they had only one dynasty, the house of David. But in the north there were 9 different dynasties. One of the dynasties was the house of Omri. Omri introduced, as not had been introduced before, great disgusting idolatry. And he brought it in from Phoenicia. And his son was even worse, Ahab, who married Jezebel, and they brought in degrading forms of idolatry. And so apostasy was rampant. God, therefore, rose up a man by the name of Jehu, which would be another dynasty, and exterminated the house of Ahab. So Jehu's dynasty started in 842 BC. He had 4 different kings following him, more than that actually, but the 4th king of his dynasty is Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II reigned, as I mentioned, longer than any other king reigned. And just to give you the idea, you cannot see or read the words on the chart, but the reason that I have it simply is for one particular fact. As you can see, the bar graph on the right, that is the orange graph that we're following on the right, those are the kings of Israel. And the longest reigning king, he reigned 41 years in Israel. And his name comes right down here on the chart. And look at his bar graph. The longest reigning king that Israel had ever seen. He was the wealthiest king. He extended the borders more broadly than they had ever been extended before. They were wealthy, they were at peace, but when we lack a moral order, then imminent is the collapse. And he was only 20 years out at his death from the time that the kingdom of Israel was going to finally collapse completely under the pressure of Assyria, 722 BC. He died in 740, in 722, it was all gone. So let's think about the reign of Jeroboam II for just a moment. In the first place, Jeroboam is said to be, interestingly, a savior, or at least one who saved Israel. Now his grandfather was Jehoahaz. That's the son of Jehu. Jehu's kingdom, his reign, ended in disaster, and his son Jehoahaz took the throne. And the Bible reads this way in 2 Kings chapter 13, and we'll be in chapter 14 for the balance, and then the book of Amos. In chapter 13 and verse 5, we are told that God saved Israel by the hand of Jehoahaz. God still loved his people in spite of the deep apostasy in which they found themselves. And so he sent a savior, Jehoahaz, and that's the word that is used in the text. In like manner, in chapter 14 now and verse 27, his grandson, Jeroboam II, is said to have saved Israel. God wanted to save the country, and so he gave him or them a king. And Jehoahaz, his grandson, Jeroboam II, took the throne in 781 BC. As mentioned, he reigned for 41 years, and it was a fabulous reign as far as worldly standards are concerned. For in the first place, we'll notice that there is only one text that mentions the reign of Jeroboam II in the book of Kings. And it's in chapter 14 of 2 Kings that we mentioned a moment ago, and now the verse is 25. We are told that he restored the borders of Lebo-Hamath, far north, all the way down to the Gulf, or rather the Dead Sea, which is called the Sea of the Arabah. That's far south. Let's notice the far north. When Solomon reigned, the extent of Solomon's kingdom was wider than it had ever been, and the far northern extension of that kingdom was what was called the Gates of Hamath. That would be a mountain pass that leads to a town called Hamath. It is 200 miles north of Samaria, the capital where Jeroboam reigned. And that led into the valley of the Orontes. He put there at Hamath a governor to oversee the city. And so he restored the borders all the way far north. He was a powerful military king. And he restored the borders all the way to Lebo-Hamath, that is the city of Hamath in the far north. Now in the far south, in order to take that territory, he had to conquer the people of Moab. Consequently, he took that territory as well, the far south. The only thing that was left was the territory of Judah, the kingdom of the south. In other words, the extent of his territory was wider than any king before him in the northern kingdom. And that meant something, and that's something that we need to pay attention to, and that is it brought great wealth into the kingdom. They were wealthier than they had ever been. They had more taxation. They had more money. They had more trade. Consequently, it was the wealthiest time of the northern kingdom. Everything looked like it was going great guns. Not only so, but Jeroboam II had no black marks against his name according to this text. Now we know that he left the idolatrous places of Dan at north and Bethel in his south, as well as the Queen of Heaven. He had a temple to the Queen of Heaven, as Ashtaroth. He had the temple to the Queen of Heaven. But he did not introduce into Israel any new idolatrous practices or take it deeper than it was. At least we have not the information given to us in Kings at all. And that meant something else, and that meant great peace was in the kingdom of Jeroboam II. He had great wealth. He had extensive territories. He had great peace in the kingdom. And the people enjoyed it in the northern kingdom of Israel, in the capital of Samaria, and all the lands around it. Not only so, they were enjoying it, but they also had great wealth. They had great peace. They had peace with the kingdom of Judah because he was a powerful king, and no one dared even attack them. But the integrity or the morals of people is that which gives substance to any government, any long-lasting value. And if there's not morality, then the kingdom is due to collapse. And there was wickedness rampant in Jeroboam II's kingdom. Not only did the government take advantage of the peoples and rob them, but the people were only ostensibly worshiping when they did. They were also taking advantage of one another. They were robbing the poor. They were taking lands from one another. They lived in riotous living and wine, women, and song, and everything was going great, and they partied all of the time. Everything, it seemed to them, was very great. They were peaceable all the way. And that tells us that we're setting up for a collapse. As a matter of fact, you might notice this. In history, the law of God works this way, that when a government, as mentioned earlier, has no value of morality in its society, then that government is a hollow shell and it is due to collapse. That's exactly the way it has worked all through history. For example, Artaxerxes II, 338 BC, in the Persian Empire. He made peace treaties. He had the broadest expanse of his kingdom in the Persians that they had ever seen, 338. But as you note from that date, that was only about 5 years away from Alexander the Great causing the great collapse of the Persian Empire. It seemed like everything was wonderful, but it was not. Philip II in Spain took the throne in 1550 approximately, and he was astride of two different hemispheres. He had the entire territory of Europe, the continent, and also the continent of North America. And the wealth and the gold that was flowing into his coffers was immense. But in 1588, just a few years later, the famous Spanish Armada was defeated by the English Navy, and the Spanish Empire was ripped to pieces because they had no moral order inside. The same thing was the case regarding France. Louis XIV burned his bills in front of the Palace of Versailles. So powerful was he didn't care what kind of bills he had. He burned them right there in the Palace of Versailles, the gates of it. And then his successor, Louis XV, followed by Louis XVI, inherited the same wealth kingdom. But what happened? Louis XVI took the throne in 1774 when our founding fathers were meeting at Continental Congress. And in 1789 we had the French Revolution, and 1793 he was beheaded. The French kingdom had no moral constitution within it. And that's exactly the law of God throughout history. And Jeroboam II's magnificent kingdom the expanse of his territories, and the great wealth that was flowing in meant nothing as long as immorality was rampant in the society. I want you to meet a prophet by the name of Amos. Amos the prophet, Amos actually was a sheep herder from a small village called Tekoa. Now you need to note that Tekoa is 6 miles south of Jerusalem. That means he is from the southern territory of Judah. He is a sheep herder. Now we're not so familiar with that as much as cattlemen. He was like a cattleman. He simply was a man of the earth. He was simply a laborer. That's all he was. He was a poor laborer. On the side, he gathered fig trees or the fruit from figs that he might feed the poor people. That was the food of the poor people. He gathered fruit from fig trees. So he was a sheep herder. He gathered fruit from the fig trees. He was himself a poor peasant, and so we would call him a peasant prophet. And he was from the hills of Judea. God said to him, I want you to go to the northern kingdom, and I want you to preach against the powerful king Jeroboam and the idols at Dan and Bethel, and specifically at Bethel. Amos took his staff in his hand and started north. As he crossed the hills of Judea, he could see the temple of Jerusalem passing in the distance. It was only 25 miles distant. That's a long trek in those days by foot. And he finally comes to the community of Bethel. Now God promised all of them this. And by the way, they had no laws that protected freedom of speech. Now we say, well, we have the right, we have freedom of speech. I can get out here and say what I want to say, and I'm going to do what I want to do, and I can burn the flag, and everything I want. They didn't have freedom of speech. There was nothing protecting him from saying what he needed to say and what God wanted him to say. And he was taking his own life into his hands when he was going to preach against the king. But God did make a promise, just as he made to all of the prophets, as it's stated in Jeremiah. He said this to Jeremiah. He said, I will make you a fortified city, an iron pillar, and a bronze wall against the people of the land and against the kings. Notice that God promised to protect him as he spoke, and that is, I want to give you the strength to speak, but it did not promise protection from harm. It was only strength that he might speak what he needed to speak. And so he goes. They're having a high day in Bethel when he arrives there. People have gathered by the thousands around to worship the golden calf that is there. Jeroboam II is not present himself, but Amaziah the high priest is there. And here comes this poor peasant prophet. I'm reminded of this particular incident when I think about this story. In 1857, in Arkansas, Maynard, Arkansas, there was born a man by the name of W.A. Goodwin. He was a gospel preacher, W.A. Goodwin. Goodwin was a laborer, common laborer. A man worked with his hands. He was a blacksmith. And so he would shoe horses, shoe mules, make implements, sharpen the implements, all the things that blacksmiths do. He had a shop right there in Maynard. So between the Baptists and the members of the Church of Christ, and he was a Christian, he was a member of the Church of Christ, he was a famous, faithful gospel preacher. So the Baptists said, we want to get our debater to come in here and meet you. And they called Ben Bogart, who was the famous debater of the Baptist Church, a landmark Baptist organization, and he came out of Little Rock, Arkansas. He got on the train, he came up to Maynard, he got off the train at Maynard. He said, where's the man I'm going to meet? And so people that were there greeting him said, well, he's right over there in the blacksmith shop. You can see him right there. He's under that horse right there. Ben Bogart said, you know what? I didn't come over here all this way to debate some common laborer. I didn't come over here to debate some blacksmith. Our brethren said, you know what? You'll have all you can handle with W.A. Goodwin. After the debate, Bogart said, you know what? He was the best I've ever seen. And he debated Warlick, N.B. Hardeman, and others. He said he was the best because Goodwin had studied the Bible. He was studying and memorized the entire text on his spare time. Ben Bogart said, boy, I tell you what, he was the best I've ever seen. W.A. Goodwin just a peasant. So also, we have a peasant prophet, and he comes and takes the rostrum right here in Bethel. And he begins this way. This is chapter 3, verse 8 of his book. Now we're in the book of Amos. It's preserved for us, thankfully, what he had to say and what happened when he did speak it. He said, who cannot be afraid when the lion roars? And how can a prophet be silent when the Lord has spoken? Well, that gives you the sense of what is going to be spoken here. The lion has roared. Then he starts in chapter 1, verse 2. The lion has roared. Lion has roared from Jerusalem. And then there's a word from Zion. And all the pastures of the shepherds are wilting, and the top of Carmel has melted. I tell you what, we don't have preaching like that today, do we? That is to say, he was not going to pull any punches. He was going to say exactly what God wanted him to say. Now he comes to this particular passage, chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, that was read in your hearing, and a dripping with sarcasm. Come to Bethel and transgress. To Gilgal, multiply transgression. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days. Offer a sacrifice of that which is leavened. Publish and proclaim freewill offerings. This pleases you, O the people of Israel. Boy, they did not like that kind of preaching. And he pointed himself to the cows of Bashan, which are the women. Calls them cows of Bashan. That's chapter 4, verse 1. Chapter 6, I believe, is talking the same thing. To the cows of Bashan, he said that you lie upon beds of ivory, stretch yourselves upon the couches. You eat lambs out of the flock, calves out of the midst of the stall. He said, then you drink wine in bowls and anoint yourselves with chief oils, but you're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. You're enjoying yourself. And then we finally have this statement, chapter 5. I despise your feasts. I will take no delight. Have you had any preacher say that? I despise your assemblies. I despise your feasts. I will take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Yea, though you offer me your burnt offerings and meal offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of your songs. I will not hear the melody of your viols, that is, the harps. But you let justice roll down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. That is preaching that is unmixed. We did not cutting it with water at all. There was a man there, Amaziah, the high priest. That was just too much for him. And there was something that Amos had to say that really bothered him also. Not only that, but Amos had made this statement, all of these places of worship shall be desolate, and I, God, I will rise against Jeroboam with the sword. Amaziah said, you know what? I don't like this. He sent a message. Amaziah did to Jeroboam number 2. Jeroboam said, I suppose in his counting house, counting out his money. I don't know. But he sent a message to Jeroboam. He said, hey, look, you have a man here who's come from the south country, Judah, and he's prophesying against this place of worship. And not only so, he said this. He said that he is causing rebellion against you. That was, of course, a deep lie. He was not bringing a rebellion against Jeroboam. He was not talking about Jeroboam's death. And he added this statement. He said, not only is he bringing this, he said, but the land cannot bear his words. That was true. That's true. The land, when a people have become addicted to vice, sensuality, all of their entertainment, all of the fun, all of the games, they can't take straight preaching such as Amos. As a matter of fact, I don't know which Old Testament prophet could stand today in the churches and preach and be accepted. He said the land cannot bear his preaching. That was probably true. But then he made this statement also. He said he has conspired against you. That was a lie. He was not conspiring against Jeroboam. And he said that God is going to bring desolation against this place and that you're going to die by the sword. Now that was a message that Amaziah sent. Now that last part, technically not true. God had said through Amos the prophet, I will rise against Jeroboam with the sword. He didn't say I'm going to kill him with the sword, but perhaps that would be a fair conclusion to draw. Amaziah wanted, obviously, something to be done. So he appealed to the king to do it. But the king simply said, you know what? I'm in the comfort of my own home or my own palace. I have the wealth. I have the power. It doesn't matter what a poor peasant prophet is going to say. You take care of it yourself, Amaziah. Amaziah came back, said, look here. You need to go home. You don't stay here and preach anymore. You get on back. You go home. He says, as a matter of fact, you go home, back to your home in Tekoa, and there you preach for bread. Now that was implying that Amos was preaching for profit and for money. That caused Amos to respond this way. He said, I'm not a prophet. Or I was not a prophet. Nor was I a prophet's son. I didn't come from a prophetic school, in other words. And I was simply a keeper of sheep and a gatherer of figs from the sycamore or the fig tree. God called me to come here and preach. In other words, I'm not preaching for money. But he was forced to leave. But before he left, he delivered this searing statement to Amaziah the prophet, or Amaziah the high priest. He said, your wife will become a whore. Your children are going to die at the sword. You yourself are going to die, and your inheritance is going to be divided among other people, and your people are going to go to captivity. And he left. I wondered sometimes, whatever happened to these prophets? We're not told. We're not told what happened to Amos. We're not told what happened to Jeremiah at the end, what happened to Isaiah. We're not given that information, and the reason is because it's not important. What is important is that we stand for the Word of God right now where we are in our own country. We have this statement by Amos in chapter 3, verse 10. He says, the people themselves don't even know how to do right anymore. So upside down has America, Israel, America become, that our people do not understand what is right and what is wrong and what to do is right. They have no clue. Seemingly, that's exactly how Amos left it. They don't know the difference between right and wrong. So what's the point? And that is, when a kingdom or a government becomes so enmeshed in immorality, it doesn't matter how wealthy they may be or how powerful they may become, that kingdom is due to collapse. That's what's going to happen to America if we do not turn it around, and it starts with you in the pew. That's where it starts, with me at the lectern. The lesson is yours. If you want to respond to the invitation, come right now while we stand and sing.